My father asked me to change my wedding date so he could go camping with my brother. I said, sure, go ahead. But what I did at the ceremony without him knowing completely destroyed him, and now he's begging for my forgiveness. I'm 28 years old, I work in digital marketing, and 3 months ago I got married in a small ceremony in my backyard with the people who really matter to me, and my father wasn't there because he chose to go camping with my brother instead of coming to my wedding. I know how that sounds, like incredibly dramatic and like something out of a bad movie, but it's exactly what happened. And the truth is, I'm still processing all of this because part of me feels like I finally did the right thing, and another part feels guilty for having caused my dad so much pain, even though he basically brought it on himself. I guess I should start from the beginning so it makes sense, because this wasn't just about the wedding. It was the result of literally my entire life feeling like the second choice in my own family. My parents got divorced when I was like 7 years old, and my brother Theodore was 9. My mom, Dorothy, had had an affair. I mean, she was the one who basically destroyed the marriage. And even though I was young, I remember perfectly all the fights and the drama, and how my dad Leonard looked absolutely devastated for months. Theodore and I stayed living with dad most of the time, and mom moved to an apartment like 20 minutes away. The funny thing is that even after the divorce, my dad never spoke badly about mom in front of us. Like never. And I always respected that, because I know it must have been incredibly hard for him to keep quiet when she had basically betrayed him that way. About 3 years after the divorce, my mom met Howard, and honestly, he was the best thing that happened to our broken family because he was and is the kindest and most patient man I've ever met. And from the beginning, he treated me like I was his own daughter, which was ironic considering that my biological father was so obsessed with my brother that he basically forgot I existed half the time. Theodore was always the golden child, you know? Since we were kids, everything revolved around him and his achievements and his needs and his plans. He got good grades, played soccer, was popular at school, and Dad was absolutely fascinated with everything he did. I also got good grades, actually, sometimes better than Theodore's. But when I brought home a test with 100, it was like, oh, that's nice, Megan. And when Theodore brought home a 90, it was, amazing, son. I'm so proud of you. Let's celebrate. I don't know if my dad realized he was doing it. Probably not, but I definitely noticed it, and it hurt every time. I remember once in middle school, I was like 14 years old, I won a state-level writing contest, like something pretty big. And my dad went to the award ceremony but spent half the time on the phone talking to Theodore about I don't know what problem he was having with a teacher. And when the ceremony ended, he told me he was proud, but we had to leave quickly because Theodore had soccer practice. That's basically how it was all the time. Things got worse when Theodore went to college, because suddenly Dad was constantly driving 3 hours to go watch him play or to take him out to eat or just to visit him. And I was still living at home and studying at the local university because we didn't have money for both of us to go to expensive universities. I was basically invisible. Dad would ask me how school was, and I'd tell him about my classes or my projects, and he'd nod while looking at his phone, waiting for Theodore to send him a message. My mom and Howard noticed this, obviously, and Howard in particular started making a conscious effort to be present in my life in ways that my dad simply wasn't. He went to my theater performances, helped me with my job applications, listened to me talk about my friends and my problems, and never, not once, made me feel like I was a burden or like he'd rather be somewhere else. When I was 21, my mom Dorothy was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and she died like a year and a half later. It was horrible, like absolutely devastating, because despite all the drama of the divorce and the affair and all that, she was my mom, and I loved her, and Howard loved her, and watching her deteriorate like that was one of the hardest things I've ever experienced. Theodore came to visit her like 3 times during her entire illness, always with excuses about his work or his commitments, and Dad constantly defended him, saying that Theodore was very busy building his career and that Mom understood. I left my part-time job to be able to take care of Mom along with Howard, and Dad never acknowledged that sacrifice. Not once. After the funeral, Theodore went back to his life like nothing happened, and I stayed helping Howard with all the paperwork and the medical debts and the grieving process. And Dad kept calling Theodore every 2 days to see how he was dealing with the loss while he asked me like once a week if I was okay with a tone that made it clear he didn't really want to dig into the topic. Like 5 years ago, Theodore moved to London because he got an incredible job in finance. And since then, he became even more unbearable. Honestly, every time he talked to Dad, Theodore was telling him about his trips or his achievements or the important people he was meeting, and Dad listened to him like he was the most fascinating speaker in the world. I, meanwhile, had met Justin like 6 years ago. We moved in together 4 years ago, and I was basically building a normal, stable adult life. But for Dad, that wasn't as exciting as Theodore's adventures in Europe. Justin noticed the favoritism from the beginning. And at first I defended it because I don't know. I guess part of me still hoped that Dad would eventually realize and change. But Justin would tell me, "Megan, your dad is never going to change if there are no consequences for his behavior." And I didn't want to hear it because admitting that meant admitting that my dad simply didn't value me the same way he valued Theodore. Last year, Justin proposed to me on our 3-year anniversary of living together, and I obviously said yes because I love him and because he's the most constant and reliable person I've had in my life. We decided to have a small, simple wedding in the backyard of our house, like 50 people max, just close family and important friends. Nothing fancy or expensive, because we'd rather spend that money on the honeymoon or on a down payment for a house. The date we chose was our 4-year anniversary of living together, which fell on a Saturday in September, basically in 6 months, and we started planning everything with a lot of excitement. I told Dad about the date like 4 months in advance. I texted him, I called him, I made sure he had it written down in his calendar, and he said of course he'd be there, and that he was happy for me. Although honestly, his enthusiasm was like a 3 out of 10, compared to how he reacted when Theodore told him he'd gotten his job. In London, 2 months before the wedding, Dad called me and asked if we could talk about something important. I thought maybe he wanted to offer to help with expenses or ask me if I needed anything. But no. Turns out Theodore had organized a camping trip with Dad for that same weekend, because it was the only time Theodore could come visit him due to his work schedule, and Dad asked me, literally asked me, if I could move the wedding to another date so he could go camping with Theodore. I was in shock, like completely frozen on the phone because I couldn't believe he was asking me that. I explained to him that we already had everything paid for, that people had already saved the date, that it was our anniversary and we couldn't just move it to a random weekend, and he kept insisting, saying that Theodore had put a lot of effort into organizing this trip and that it meant a lot to him to be able to spend that time with his son, and I literally told him, "Dad, I'm also your daughter. This is my wedding." And he was quiet for a moment and then said, "I know, Megan, but Theodore is here so rarely. Surely you can understand." I hung up the phone and cried for like an hour while Justin hugged me and told me this was exactly what he'd been predicting for years. Part of me wanted to call Dad back and yell at him and tell him everything I'd felt my entire life. But another part was so exhausted from always being the second choice that I just didn't have the energy. After calming down a bit, I started thinking about something that made me feel a bit of control over the situation. Something vindictive, maybe, but that felt necessary. I called Howard and asked him if he would be willing to walk me down the aisle at my wedding, and he was quiet for a moment and then started crying, like literally crying, and said it would be the greatest honor of his life. I told him the whole situation with Dad and Howard got really angry. Not at me, obviously, but at Dad and Theodore for being so selfish and blind, and he told me he'd always seen me as a daughter and that nothing would make him happier than being there at that important moment. I decided not to tell Dad anything about Howard. I just let him assume that he was going to walk me down the aisle when he decided to come back from camping or whatever. A few days later, Dad called me and asked if I'd thought about changing the date, and I told him very calmly, "No, Dad, I'm not going to change the date. The wedding is in September, like it was always planned, and if you want to go camping with Theodore that weekend, that's fine. Go, enjoy your trip." He sounded surprised, like he expected me to throw a tantrum or keep arguing, but I had simply gotten to a point where I was like, you know what? If this is his decision, then so be it. I'm not going to beg my own father to come to my wedding. We hung up and didn't talk much after that, just short texts and awkward calls where he kept hinting that maybe I could reconsider, and I kept saying no. The month before the wedding, I tried not to think too much about Dad and his decision, and I focused on all the final details and on enjoying the process with Justin and with the people who were really excited for us. Howard and I practiced walking down the aisle like 3 times because he was super nervous about doing it perfectly. And every time we practiced, I realized more and more that he was really the father figure I'd needed all this time. My brother never called or texted or asked anything about the wedding, which didn't surprise me at all because Theodore basically only communicated with the family when he needed something or when he had something to brag about. Like 2 weeks before the wedding, Dad sent me a long message explaining that he was going to go camping, because it was important for Theodore and for their relationship, but that he would think about me all weekend and that he was sure the wedding would be beautiful, and I simply responded, "Okay, Dad, have fun." Without emotion or drama. The wedding day arrived, and it was honestly one of the most perfect days of my life. Despite all the previous drama, the weather was incredible. The backyard looked beautiful with all the decorations we'd put up. Our friends and family who really mattered to us were there, and I felt really happy and at peace with my decision. Howard arrived early to help me get ready, and he was super emotional. Like his eyes would fill with tears every time he saw me in the dress. And he kept saying how beautiful I looked, and how proud he was of the woman I'd become. When the time came to walk down the aisle, Howard offered me his arm and whispered to me, "I'm so happy to be here with you." And I told him, "Me too, Dad." And I called him Dad because in that moment that was exactly what he was to me, more than my biological father had ever been. The ceremony was perfect. Justin and I wrote our own vows and we cried and laughed, and basically it was everything we'd auditioned, dreamed of. The reception was intimate and fun. We danced, we ate, we drank, and every person there was genuinely happy for us. At no point during the day did I feel like something or someone was missing, honestly, because the people who really loved me and supported me were all there. At the end of the night, Justin and I were sitting on the patio steps watching our last guests leave, and he asked me if I was okay, if I regretted anything, and I told him no, that it had been the perfect day, exactly as it was. The next day, still in that post-wedding happiness bubble, I decided to send Dad a photo. I don't know exactly why I did it. Maybe part of me wanted him to know what he'd missed. Or maybe I just wanted to share my happiness even with him, despite everything. I sent him a photo of Howard and me walking down the aisle, and like 20 minutes later, my phone started ringing. It was Dad, calling over and over, and I let it ring like 4 times before answering. When I finally answered, he was literally sobbing on the other end. Like crying in a way I'd never heard him cry. Not even when Mom died. And he kept saying, "Megan, Megan, what did I do? What did I do? I missed your wedding." And I just stayed quiet, listening to him fall apart. Turns out Dad and Theodore were still camping, like literally in the middle of nowhere without good signal, and when Dad saw the photo, it all hit him at once. He told me he immediately packed his things and told Theodore he had to leave, and Theodore apparently got angry and told him he was being ridiculous and dramatic, but Dad left anyway, driving back like crazy. He asked me over and over if we could have a second ceremony, even if it was something small, just so he could be present, and I told him no. That the wedding had already happened and I wasn't going to put on a fake show just to make him feel better about his decision. He kept crying and saying he was so sorry and that he'd been the worst father and that he didn't. You know what he was thinking. And I finally told him, "Dad, do you know how many times in my life I've needed you to be there for me, and you weren't? Do you know how many times you chose Theodore over me? This isn't just about the wedding. It's about my entire life feeling like I wasn't enough for you." I think that was the first time I really told him all that so directly, and he was quiet for a moment and then said something like, I didn't know you felt that way." And I literally told him, "How could you not realize, Dad? You never asked me about my life with the same interest you asked Theodore. You were never at my important events. You never defended me when Mom was sick and Theodore wasn't coming. Always, always, always Theodore was the priority." And he cried more and told me I was right. That he'd been a horrible father to me and that he had no excuse. And I told him I knew he had no excuse. That was exactly the point. I told him I needed time to process all this, and that I didn't want to talk to him for a while, and he begged me not to cut him out of my life, that he'd do anything to fix it. And I told him I wasn't cutting him out. I just needed space. The following days, Dad sent me messages every day. Like long messages, apologizing and explaining that he was going to therapy and that he was trying to understand why he'd favored Theodore so much and that he wanted to be better. Part of me appreciated the effort, but another part was like, you can't fix 30 years of emotional abandonment with some nice text messages, you know? Justin completely supported me in maintaining my boundaries. And Howard, too. Both of them told me I didn't have to forgive Dad just because he now felt guilty. That forgiveness was something that had to come from me when and if I was ready. Like a week before we left for our honeymoon, I called Dad and told him he needed to stop sending me messages every day. That it was overwhelming me and that I needed this time, with Justin, to enjoy without having the guilt and drama of our situation constantly in my head. He agreed, although he sounded devastated, and told me he would respect my space and that he'd be there when I was ready to talk. I thought with that everything would be calm for a while. But oh no, Theodore had other plans apparently. In the middle of our honeymoon, literally, we were on an incredible beach in Greece trying to relax and enjoy after months of stress. My phone rang from an unknown number. Normally I don't answer numbers I don't recognize, but something made me answer this time, and it was Theodore, calling from a borrowed or burner phone or something because I had him blocked on my real phone. He immediately started yelling at me about how I'd destroyed Dad, about how I was a terrible and selfish daughter, about how family was the most important thing and I was being dramatic about something as small as a wedding. I literally was in shock, because Theodore almost never called me. Like we'd gone years without talking directly beyond curt messages at Christmas, and here he was calling me on my honeymoon to lecture me about family. I let him talk for like 2 minutes, listening to all his bullshit about family responsibility and how I was being immature, and when he finally shut up for a second, I told him, Theodore, at what point in your entire adult life have you cared about family? You didn't come when Mom was dying. You haven't come to visit Dad except when you need something from him. You moved to the other side of the world and basically abandoned any family responsibility you might have had, and now you're going to lecture me about family because I finally set a boundary. He started arguing something about his work commitments, and I just told him, you know what, Theodore? I don't owe you any explanation. I don't owe you my time, and I definitely won't let you ruin my honeymoon with your hypocrisy. And I hung up. Justin was furious when I told him. Like, really angry. And wanted to call Dad to tell him to control Theodore, but I told him it wasn't worth it. That Theodore was like that, and probably Dad had cried to him about the situation, and Theodore felt he had to defend his father without really understanding the full context. I blocked the number Theodore had called from and tried not to let it ruin the rest of our trip, although it definitely left me thinking a lot about the whole family dynamic and about whether there could ever be a healthy relationship with any of them. When we got back from the honeymoon, like 2 weeks later, I decided I needed to have a final conversation with Dad to establish exactly how things were going to be from now on, because I couldn't just ignore him forever, but I also couldn't go back to the dynamic from before. I went to his house on a Wednesday afternoon, and when he opened the door, he looked terrible, like he hadn't slept well in weeks, and he immediately hugged me and started apologizing. Again. I told him we needed to talk seriously, and we sat down in the living room, and I basically put all my cards on the table. I told him I understood that he loved Theodore and that was fine, but that love didn't have to be a competition, and he'd treated our relationship like it was exactly that my entire life. I told him that if he wanted to have any kind of relationship with me from now on, it had to be genuine, and not just because he felt guilty about missing my wedding. I explained that I wasn't going to be available to him in the same way as before, that it was going to be limited contact for a good while until I felt I could trust that he valued our relationship. He cried again and told me he understood, and that he'd do whatever I needed, that he just wanted the chance to try. I asked him directly if he'd talked to Theodore about all this, and he admitted he had, that Theodore had called him after the camping trip and that Dad had explained why he'd left early. I asked him what Theodore had said, and Dad looked uncomfortable, but finally told me that Theodore had said I was exaggerating and being melodramatic, and that Dad was being emotionally manipulated. I asked Dad what he thought about that, and to his credit, he said he defended my position and told Theodore he was wrong. That Dad had been a bad father to me, and that it was time for Theodore to also examine his role in this broken family. Apparently, Theodore had hung up angry after that, and they hadn't talked since then. I established clear rules with Dad that day. No more comparisons with Theodore, no more expecting me to adjust my life to accommodate Theodore's schedules, and definitely no more situations where I had to compete for his attention. I told him that if he could respect those boundaries, eventually we could work on rebuilding our relationship, but that it was going to take time, possibly years, and that he had to be at peace with that. He agreed to everything. And for the first time in my life, I felt like he was really listening to me, like he was really seeing what he'd done and how it had affected me. Now 3 months have passed since the wedding, and things with Dad are in a strange place, but not necessarily bad. We talk like once every 2 weeks, usually on the phone, short conversations about how we are, about the weather, about superficial things, and that's okay for now. He sends me photos of random things that remind him of me, like, I don't know, a pretty sunset or a dog he saw at the park, and I think it's his way of trying to be present without being overwhelming. I don't know if we'll ever have a normal father-daughter relationship, honestly, but at least now I feel like I'm in control of my own boundaries and not just accepting the crumbs of attention he wants to give me. Theodore and I haven't talked since that call on the honeymoon, and honestly, it doesn't bother me at all. We never had a close relationship as adults anyway, and whatever connection we had as kids was lost years ago under layers of resentment and toxic family dynamics. Maybe someday we can have a real conversation about all this, but it's not a priority for me right now, and I'm definitely not going to be the one to initiate that contact. Justin and I moved to a new house last month, something small but ours, and we're focused on building our own family and our own life away from all the drama. Howard comes to visit us like every 2 weeks and helps me with house projects, and those are the moments where I feel really grateful for the people I have in my life, the ones who chose to be there without me having to beg them. Last week, Dad asked me if he could come see the new house, and I told him I wasn't ready for that yet, that I needed this space to be just mine and Justin's for now, without the complications of our family history. He said he understood and didn't insist, which was a nice change compared to how he would have reacted before. I don't know when or if I'll ever feel ready to let him see this part of my life, but for now, it's okay to maintain that distance. I guess, in the end, this isn't really about forgiving or not forgiving, but about recognizing that you can't force people to value you the way you need to be valued, and that sometimes you have to create distance to protect your own peace of mind. Part of me still hurts when I think about everything I lost by not having a father who really saw me. But another part is at peace, knowing I finally put my needs first, and that that's okay. And that's enough for now, I think.